Hello, I'm Hutch and this is how I use ink. First up, the materials that I use. I always have a bit of scrap paper where I can test the opacity of the ink and a piece of kitchen roll, which you can see is very messy, that I use to dab excess water off on. So onto my favourite paper at the moment. This is chatty cotton rag paper. It's got a really lovely texture to it and the ink sits on it really lovely. I get it in A4 and then I chop it down to whatever size I'd like to work with it. I tend to work on loose leaves of paper rather than a sketchbook, and any scraps I save and do little drawings on as kind of warm-ups for larger pieces. Onto some of the tools I use. So I use a mechanical pencil and this eraser I got from Tiger. It's both quite standard and I'm not that picky really about them. So next up I've got a bamboo dip pen. I've got this only recently and I still haven't quite got to grips with it. For my brushes I have this larger kind of wash brush, and then I have a fine liner brush and a kind of middle ground brush. My favourite way to apply ink is with a brush, especially these little fine liners. And lastly I have a pipette which helps me portion out the ink so I don't waste any and I don't muddy the ink pots. For my normal inks that I use a lot, I have them in these little pipette jars I got off Amazon. These allow me to again save ink, and also I don't have to worry about washing up the pipette every time I use it. I have quite a small range of colours as I predominantly use the black ink, but if I do want to do something a bit brighter then I can. The black ink I use Frisk drawing ink. This is really good, it's one of my favourite inks to use and it's quite affordable. For the colours, all the rest they are from Jackson's Art Supplies. I also have a small selection of botanical inks which are really lovely to work with. I'll link the Etsy seller that I got these from down below. I think I want to do another video on botanical inks and I'd like to eventually one day try and make some of my own, but these are really good. So now for some painting. I start off by doing a rough sketch with my mechanical pencil, and then I go in with, this is the Frisk drawing ink that I've watered down, and I just fill in the rough shapes of the animal or the main subject of my drawing. I don't tend to be very neat at this point and I just kind of fill in the space with the ink. The way that I paint with inks is very similar to watercolour painting, as that's what I have quite a large background in. I used to paint a lot with watercolours when I was younger, and so that's transferred into my ink process, so you'll see me using washes and slowly building up the colours. This is just how I'm enjoying using inks at the moment. They're very versatile. You can use them like a watercolour or you can use them opaque and do lots of line work with them. I use a mixture of all of these kind of techniques in my style, but if you're just starting out I would encourage you to have a bit of a play around, see what you can do and what you enjoy doing with them. Why I use inks instead of watercolours is that once the ink that I use is dried, it won't be reactivated with water, so I can let it dry and then I can come back and put an extra layer on top without it affecting the colour that I've already put down. Now that I've put down my first wash, I'm letting it dry, and in the meantime I'm having a bit of an experiment with my new bamboo dip pen. I haven't quite got to grips with this yet, and I think I prefer using my paintbrush, but I am very comfortable with my paintbrush and this bamboo dip pen is new, so I think I just need a bit more practice with it. I'd also like to have a go at using metal nib dip brush at some point in the future as well. Now that the first layer of wash is dried, I'm going in with more opaque ink. I've just made it less translucent by adding less water, and that's where the scrap of paper that I showed at the start comes in, because every time I dip my brush in the water and in the ink, it changes its opacity a bit, so I practice on a bit of paper at the side, see how dark it's going to be before putting the ink down on my actual drawing. Much like with watercolour, once you put down a dark layer of ink, you can't go back and make it lighter again unless you go over with white ink, but the white ink I find tends to leave kind of almost bluish tone, so it won't match exactly. As a general rule of thumb, I put down the lightest layers of ink first and slowly build up the opacity and the dark layers. Now that I've got the basic shading and shape of the illustration down, I'll go in and create more texture on the piece. So here I'm just doing kind of wiggly lines, changing up the strokes of the brushes that I'm using and the edges of the lines creates that texture and that movement and adds in a lot more visual intrigue to the piece. It's definitely worth having a bit of a play around with the different shapes and lines you can create. Those experiments won't always work out, but those are the moments where you really learn how to paint. I also quite like just stippling in some of the areas. This gives kind of a mottledy texture. When I'm working with inks, I also sometimes like to let it dry and then see what the true values are, because when the ink is wet it can come out looking a lot darker than it will actually dry to. I also think it's worth taking a step back and to look at what kind of areas of the piece need more dark places and what areas of the piece are kind of dark enough. So I'm going in now with my bamboo dip pen, and this is a bit of an experiment. I'm kind of drawing in these lines with kind of smaller lines radiating from them. This is a bit of an experiment for me. I've never done this on a drawing before. However, one of my favourite artists on Instagram called Inkdoski, I think I've got that right, I'll leave a link to their Instagram below, does this on their portraitures, and it adds a lot of really beautiful kind of texture and intrigue to the piece. So I'm just kind of trialling this on the frog. You can see where I was waiting for the paper to dry before I've had a good play around with the different kind of shapes. Now here I was using the dip pen, but I kind of gave up because I was struggling with it a little bit, and I've gone back to kind of my fine liner paintbrush. This is one of my favourite brushes to use, and I'm just going in and adding some of the little details. At this point I was kind of thinking I've messed up the piece by putting in these lines and kind of thinking like, oh dear, what have I done? However, I kept going, and once I kind of committed to this new kind of method of adding in detail, I really liked how it turned out. I definitely think I'll be using these kind of lines and details in pieces going forward. I haven't really decided what they'd look good on. I think they work quite well on the frog. It might be something which won't look as good on, say, a kind of fluffy animal like a sheep or a lamb. However, some of the subjects like frogs or insects, I think this could be really nice way of building texture. One of the things I really like about ink painting and painting in general is kind of meditative. Now that I'm editing it and I'm doing a voiceover, I've kind of realised that, this is over an hour's worth of footage I filmed for this piece. However, it went by in minutes drawing this and painting this, and that's not including the time that I spent, waiting for different layers to dry, and it's a really enjoyable process. I don't always like how the final piece looks, but the most important thing is that I really like the process of putting my paintbrush to paper, and I think that's something that is really important. If you enjoy inking, then ink, but if you try inking and you don't enjoy it, then try a different media, the one that you do enjoy. So one of the things I kind of struggled with is that I really like the look of gouache pieces of art. However, whenever I've used gouache in the past, I've just not enjoyed painting with it. I've not enjoyed how it dries, and I found layering it frustrating, and I could never get the kind of colours turning out the way I wanted them to, or the texture the way I wanted it to. And that's frustrating in itself, because you see other artists creating really stunning pieces of work, but you yourself just don't click with that material. But when you do find a material that you click with, it's really rewarding. Like I said, my pieces don't always come out the way I want them to, but I enjoy the process of the painting, and that's the important thing. This is the point of the frog painting when I'm starting to really vibe with it. The more watered down kind of line texture on the legs and on the body, I think looks really good with the more opaque lines, and it's really starting to come together as a piece, and I was really happy that I kind of stuck with this technique and this kind of experiment. I also decided at this point that I kind of wanted a bit more of a background to the frog, partly because I'd drawn the frog too far down the page. There's a lot of white space at the top, so I let the frog dry so the ink won't move. I'm still kind of careful that I'm not getting the ink around and I've just used, this is some low tack masking tape, which is quite good, and I'm just coming in with this kind of wash to do the background. I don't normally do the backgrounds at the end, and like I was saying before, I normally try and put the lightest colours at the start, but this was kind of a last minute decision to go in with the background, so it wasn't really done in the correct order, but that's okay. It's been a bit of an experimental session. I think that the kind of lines on the frog are really cool, and it's something I'd like to incorporate and try out a little bit more. So the idea behind these kind of circular blobs I'm kind of drawing is that they are going to be lily pads. I've actually lost the footage of me putting in the final details, but I basically go in with these big kind of circles and then I put in slightly more opaque kind of lines. I've kind of left them a lot lighter to make the frog the full piece, and the final piece I really like the look of how it's turned out. I hope you've enjoyed this kind of quick talk through of some of the tools and some of the materials I use for ink and some of the techniques I use. If you've wanted to have a go at painting with inks, I encourage you to just do it. So I hope you enjoyed this video. My style might change for inks, but it's a journey. So thanks for watching.